Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Orlando, Florida, at the very tail end of the Air Force Association's annual Air Warfare Symposium. This year's topics, Command and Control and Fusion Warfare. Our coverage here is sponsored by DRS Technologies, and we have with us frankly, one of the most legendary airmen of this generation, war hero.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Illustrious Air Force Acquisition Chief, long career with Boeing, leader in Air Force Association, as well as somebody who's still actively engaged in all this stuff, Lieutenant General George Muellner. Sir, thanks very much for joining us.
Very happy to be here.
I will always remember that hearing that you and I were in, and this is like a very, very long time ago when the small UAVs were on the table, the micro UAVs, and I pointed them and I said, hey, so these you reverse engineered these from the things in Area 51, and he said, God, Vago, everybody always gets that wrong. They're really in the basement of Wright Pat, right near my office. Yeah. And then I remember there was another reporter standing there.
These UFOs that we were talking about, right?
And then the guy next to us, who was not an aerospace reporter, was like, did I just see a massive revelation? Yeah. I want to take you to a topic. Dave Deptula raised this issue, that if you consider it from a state-on-state competition standpoint, your generation had a World War II and Korea generations that were your mentors. Those were state, particularly World War II was a state-on-state. Mm-hmm. And you could argue that the Vietnam War was really the war from hell because it was a counterinsurgency that was combined with the absolute highest-end, most sophisticated air defenses, driving your generation to then start working on increased precision so you're not bombing the same bridge 50 times and losing aircraft and still not getting anywhere. Stealth, obviously, to get into these kind of, to find better ways of suppressing enemy defenses. Radar, the guided weapon, everything came from that experience that you guys had. And one of the things that Dave made was, he said, if you consider it, 85% of everybody who's serving in uniform has joined since 9/11, and that it has been a counterterrorism fight at the lowest end, which still has casualty implications, certainly on the ground force. But if you go to state on state, those curves change. And the question is, since we've had such a long period of counterinsurgency, is there a challenge rebuilding a state-on-state fighting ethos that you experienced coming in during the height of the Cold War when you guys were doing these kind of exercises, always getting ready for it, and then going to Vietnam, doing the job there? What are some? Are you confident? Are there challenges? Do we need to think differently? Does the Air Force leadership need to think differently to prepare a new cadre of airmen who are ready? And sort of another question there is, at what point do national leaders have to prepare the American people potentially for what could be happening, given in Vietnam 7,000 aircraft were lost? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think just to correct one thing, I went straight out of pilot training to Vietnam. But I had mentors, like you said, that had the experience of primarily Korea and the historical precedents from certainly World War II. Where losses were very, very high. And so when I was going through training and then off to first Cam Ranh Bay and then later Ubon, there was an expectation. I lost my roommate over there. Losses were a fact of life. If we have another major engagement like that where we're going into a contested environment, and it's all relative, obviously. A contested environment today is a lot more contested than North Vietnam was, but it was contested, especially with the capabilities we had then. I mean, we didn't have the situational awareness. We had a piece of radar homing and warning gear that most often now a lot of folks turned off because it was continually false alarming and what have you. And like you said, you get SA-2s, telephone poles coming at you, while you still have to watch out for, MiGs and what have you. It's a different environment. And, I think the American people, Vietnam, we saw what the result of that was. And, we ended up with a lot of folks that we had to bring home many years later, a lot of folks that didn't come home and so on. So a future conflict, I think, is going to be very much like that. The difference, I think, is, and I think the Air Force is and the other services are preparing for it, is the situational awareness issue. You heard the chief this week talk about multi-domain command and control. Well, to the pilot out there, the issue is really situational awareness. You're going into an environment today knowing so much more than we did when we went in. Whether it was an air sovereignty type mission or a ground attack type mission. And if you look, and I don't know if you heard the F-22, F-35 presentation, which they gave over on Capitol Hill also, is that ability to control the information environment gives you a lot more capability to engage when it's at your advantage and not engage when it's not. With my F-35 background, I have a heritage with that program, and I found it humorous. That issue we went to where an F-16 outmaneuvered it. If you end up in a phone booth in today's war, you're going to die. Doesn't matter what kind of airplane you got or what have you. So the issue is having the information available to you, the situational awareness, and so on. That you never end up there, and I think that's where things are going, and that's what we didn't have in Vietnam.
One of the things that, there weren't just the telephone pole-sized missiles you had to avoid relatively high, but then if you also got relatively low, there were a whole bunch of people with 12
Trust me, I know from experience because I had to jump out of an airplane because of getting hit. And so...
I was trying to lead up to that elegantly, but...
Yeah. 57 millimeter guns can reach out and affect you. It's the same issue today, though. Ground defenses, if you look at what the Chinese or the Russians are capable of and what the Iranians are trying to put in place, for their, high priority targets, they are very heavily defended. And, in the end game may still be a gun. It's probably going to be a Gatling gun or something like that with a high rate of fire. But you got multiple surface-to-air missiles and what have you that you have to defend against. And again, it's the issue of knowing where they are, being able to plan around it. Obviously, in our newer airplanes, the ability to control your signature. Future, controlling your signature, just not to RF threats, but to EO threats, is going to be a very important issue, and it's becoming more important. So I think that the situational awareness aspect gives you the ability to plan the engagement a lot better. When we were going into North Vietnam, we didn't have much control over the engagements. Somebody else was planning them, from the standpoint of the red side. And in today's world, that shouldn't happen again.
Do you think, are we doing all the right things to prepare for that environment? Because if you look at it, and I know that you do have history with the F-35 program. I've over time been supportive of that program as well, covered it from the day that it was born, effectively, with Rob Holzer many, many decades ago, as I remember, that there is concern now, well, is the airplane too short-legged? Are the airplanes and systems we're buying too short-legged? And are we doing the kind of things that will actually allow us at much more controllable risk to go into these kind of environments, given how much the Russians are investing to make it very, very hard for us, and also hold our bases at risk, right? I mean, that was also another thing that, we historically in World War II, we weren't all that worried. Mm-hmm. In this case, whether it's DF-21s.
Folks around London wouldn't have agreed with you, but,
it's true that there were enormously high casualties, but our bases were under risk, but not the kind of risk that they may be in the future.
Absolutely true. And I think, there have been, I work with the Scientific Advisory Board, and we've had a number of studies that have highlighted those issues, and Air Force and DOD are moving forward, I think, to try to mitigate some of them. I think you asked me about the F-35. Is it too short-legged? Always like to have more gas. It makes some scenarios very difficult from a CONOP standpoint. I think that's, but the other side of that coin is you really have to ask yourself, do we expect to be going into mainland China or Russia with a fighter force? I don't think so. And it doesn't mean that there wouldn't be some scenario, and then you have to make use of packaging and other elements to provide you the survivability and tankers for the range and what have you, and you have to roll back the threat to allow that sort of CONOPS to materialize. But, you'd like to have a little longer legs on all the airplanes. I never flew an airplane that I didn't want more gas in without degrading the performance and what have you.
Do you think, you are working a little bit on penetrating counter-air. I don't want to put you on the spot on that. But what are some of the attributes that you think will be necessary for that penetrating counter-air, penetrating EW platform that this Air Force is looking at, and by extension even the Navy has some interest in that as well?
Well, I think a couple of the obvious ones are if you are going to penetrate, you need to reduce your signature, and as I said, that's more than just RF signature, and it includes EO and potentially other signatures also. I think the other aspect is that if you're going to go in and do that, you need to have the payload available. The great thing about fourth-gen airplanes is you got all kinds of pylons you can hang stuff on. You don't really care about that other than the drag. Fifth-gen airplanes, unfortunately, if you want to retain your signature, you have a more difficult time doing that. So I think one of the big issues is you need more payload capability, meeting missiles if you're into air sovereignty. I think the other side of it is, as I mentioned a moment ago, the air-to-air engagement environment has changed. I grew up in the Nellis Range complex with the aggressors, and a lot of the end game was close-in maneuvering and what have you. Even when I was in F-15s in Europe, at Bitburg, we did all the long-range stuff when we went down to Decce Mamano and so on, but we always ended up in the phone booth. And we ended up there, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is some of our adversaries didn't have any long-range capability, and they wanted training also. And it was a most severe environment for maneuvering the airplane. Well, maneuvering the airplane these days is, not a big deal. They're very pilot-friendly. It's using the systems. I was talking to Secretary Peters this morning, and he's going to go fly one of the simulators, I think. And I said, flying the sim is not flying the airplane. Your biggest deal is going to be what you do with your fingers on the stick and the throttles with all of the buttons that control the sensors and the other systems on the airplane. And so I think a key part of any system in the future is one that can support that multi-domain issue that the chief talked about.
The man-machine interface piece of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen a lot of cases in some of our RPA ground stations where all the information is there, and you just can't use it, because it's not human-friendly in the interface and what have you. And the same is worse in an airplane, where you got the dynamic environment involved also. So having an interface where and I might add, from what I've seen, and I've only flown the simulator, the F-35 has done an excellent job on the sensor fusion, and that airplane's got more sensors on it than any fighter in history. Same is true in the F-22. So that is a key issue of anything we do going forward.
Let me take you to a personal and then zoom back out again.
Okay.
As a young pilot, you're going to Vietnam. What was going through your mind? And what were, and it gave you an opportunity to talk about, your experiences there, and what were the lessons that you carried from that conflict that shaped your career and thinking?
I think one of the most important ones is once I got out of training and went to Vietnam, and I really appreciate the Air Force's refocusing on the squadron. because you end up with a very close bond with a lot of people that are going through exactly what you're going through and have come through that same journey to get there. And so they know what your apprehensions are, what you may not know that you should know, and and how to react in any given situation. So the squadron is really an important element of that, I think, as you go forward, especially into a really hostile environment. I think the other aspect of it is you really need to understand that in that type of environment, every once in a while somebody's not going to come back. Like I said, in my case, I lost my roommate over there. And unfortunately, I was part of the SARCAP over him, and he ended up getting shot on the ground. But I think you have to accept that. It makes your training more intense. It makes your study more intense. I started jogging more, to have the physical fitness to evade if I needed to. I put another clip in for my 9mm pistol, and so on. But it's the squadron folks, I think, are the ones that really provide the cohesiveness to get through those situations and to understand how real they are and what you need to do to avoid them.
Let's talk about your encounter with a 57mm. Why don't you tell people, what happened that day and how you got out of it?
Well, it was
literally how you got out of it.
Yeah, it was a close air support mission in the northwestern part of Vietnam, actually the western part of Vietnam. We were supporting American troops. Bad weather. Got launched off the alert pad at Cameron. Got out there, had to make multiple passes under the weather. Obviously, a lot of folks were shooting at us, and we got hit in the belly, in one of them, and turned. It was immediately obvious that we weren't going to continue flying too long because we were kind of burning across the belly of the airplane from the shrapnel, and so on. Tried to head back towards Benoit, Saigon area, I guess Ho Chi Minh City now, and kind of in the middle of what then was the Michelin rubber plantation. Finally, I think we ran out of gas because it all leaked out the belly and burned, and had to bail out. Fortunately, on the way down, I was talking to what turned out to be some Army helicopters, and hit the ground. There were some unfriendlies in the area, so I laid there kind of blinking in their direction, and these two Army helicopters came in and picked us up and took us to their base and what have you. Again, it's interesting. We did all this practice for search and rescue where you pop the flare and, the crew watches the smoke. I was laying in the mud trying to reload my gun, and this skid of the helicopter lands. He probably didn't know where my leg was, and I didn't know the skid was coming, but boy, I was sure thankful to see him.
Let's zoom out to the macro. What did you think of your whole experience there, and how it prepared you for your career, and how it shaped your thinking?
Well, both that year at Cameron and then another year I put in at UBAN really framed my attitude when I went back, because I immediately went back as an instructor. And so I think it set the stage for what I tried to convey to the students and what have you. The other part of it also is I was flying F-4s. And the F-4s we had, first tour were C models, and they were effectively Navy airplanes repainted. Second tour were D models. C or D, neither one had a gun, and so we went in with some air-to-air missiles, and if we weren't on a ground attack mission, all we had were the air-to-air missiles. And so when I came back, I had the opportunity one day. I got a call and asked if I would be interested in going over and being one of the early F-15 guys at Edwards. And, it took me about 3 heartbeats to agree to do that. And I had good counsel. My boss was a guy named Larry Welsh, who, probably one of the most logical, rational people I've ever met. And he said, really stupid if you didn't do this. And so what that did is when I went over to Edwards, it allowed me to drive some things into the F-15 to help make the cockpit more user-friendly, to get more fuel in the airplane. So we went from the A to C very quickly and so on. And most of that was as a result of my experiences in combat.
And let me ask you, last question, zooming back out. Do you, from an ethos perspective, the Air Force does pride itself. The Air Force does spend a lot of time talking about its heritage. There are opportunities for airmen, experienced airmen, veteran airmen to talk in small groups. Obviously, the Academy has a lot of ROTC units also work to try to do that. And certainly at the schoolhouses, there's opportunity to do that. Are you confident that those skills will be easily rebuilt? Because it's a slightly it affects your thinking, given how, and in your case that's true that you went right from pilot training right into combat. But for a lot of people, they were engaged in that high intensity. ORIs had a real urgency to them. Talking to Chuck Horner about what ORIs used to be like, especially as an F-105 guy, was like, the guy didn't square a corner, you flunked, and then and you had guys like Curtis LeMay tearing around about the.
No, trust me, I've been there. I ran the Stanovel team in Europe for a year or over a year. I think the thing that really helps, and I'll choose the AFA just for a moment. I joined the AFA as a second lieutenant because they were hosting a really experienced fighter pilot in the club, and I was just straight out of pilot training, straight out of college and so on. And I went to listen to him, and he was fresh back from Uban and what have you. And so those types of exchanges are really important. The good news is we have a fair number of venues that do that. What we have now, and it was built, by the way, as a result of our Vietnam experience, are things like red flag, green flag, and all the other exercises that we conduct. And if you look somewhere on the wall up at Nellis, because I was 57th wing commander in the 57th wing up there as the vice and so on, the thing that you see is we're trying to instill the first day of the war in folks, so they don't have to learn the hard way. And I think those exercises and so on, now that they're revitalized, are going to do that.
Last question on hypersonics. We talked to Mark Lewis, mutual friend, good friend of yours.
Yes.
And Mark mentioned to me also that, some people say hypersonics will always be in the future. Could he have possibly been talking about you?
Yeah, actually my quote was, hypersonics is the future of aerospace and always will be. Having said that, I really am a supporter. My experience at Boeing was one of my divisions owned both the active hypersonic program, the X-51, and another one called High Fly. And so I'm optimistic about the future, but we want to tend to go fast, and there's still a lot of the basics that we don't fully understand. We can't effectively model the flow paths in a lot of cases, and they become very complex, with separations and so on. So I'm optimistic it's going to happen. I just don't know what the date is.
Let me ask you one last question, because this is such a great opportunity. As you look at somebody as professional as you on the engineering side, on the combat side, on the strategy side of things, when you look at what China is doing and what Russia is doing in particular, what do you see that concerns you, and what do you see that doesn't concern you?
Well, I think one of the things that concerns me overall, and I'll come back to China and Russia in a second, is our workforce in this country is aging. We're not producing the number of STEM graduates, scientists and engineers and what have you, that we should be. There are other draws beyond aerospace and what have you for these high-quality people and so on. So it's a quantity issue. Quality, they're really good. I was down at USC here a couple of weeks ago and met with a bunch of them. And, I mean, these, I wouldn't have made it. And I have 3 master's degrees, and I wouldn't have made it. And so they're really good, but it's the numbers. The other, I think, issue that I worry about is, we see a lot of things about the Chinese stealth airplanes and the Russian stealth airplanes. The reality is we're seeing a lot of prototypes. What bothers me more is when they start fielding these things in very large numbers. If you look at the Chinese Air Force today, yeah, they've got these 2 new models coming along, but the vast majority of their Air Force are effectively MiG-21s, F-7s. As they surface more and more of these new airplanes, and of more concern is they field more and more of these advanced SAMs and the integrated air defense systems. Now all of a sudden that's a major issue.
Sir, it's always an honor. Thank you very, very much. And would love to talk to you whenever you've got time. Anytime you tell me, hey, I got something interesting to say, we'll put you on.
Just don't relate me to the heritage of the World War II Korean group. We learned from them, but I wasn't amongst them.
Sir, thanks very much.
All right, take care.